Asia Tech Podcast with Graham Brown and Michael Waits.
Tuesday evening, Graham Brown and Michael Waits on Asia Tech Podcast. Michael, how you doing?
I am super. How are you? How was your day?
Yeah, very good, very good. And my voice is holding up. Your voice sounding
Much
okay?
better than last week. Much better than last week. For some reason, I don't know why. I got on the phone and just started coughing and choking. Let's hope it doesn't happen again.
Exactly. We've been busy doing interviews.
Are we live now?
We are live.
I love being live. And we're on what, Periscope, right?
We're on Periscope. We're on Twitter.
It just doesn't get any better than that.
It is. The technology is there.
It's just insane. So if anybody has any questions, they just post it to ATP Tech Pod?
Asia Tech Pod. They can hit us up. Yeah, they can hit us up. Asia Tech Pod. We'll pick up anything, any questions they have about the podcast. Obviously, during the podcast would be best, but afterwards, if they pick it up on the archive, we'll also pick up those questions. So tonight we're talking about podcasting.
It's a little meta inside a meta.
It is,
right?
Yeah. Why are we talking about it?
I'm talking about it because I feel like we've hit a little bit of an inflection point for growth, and I think it's interesting to talk about why that growth happens, how that growth happens, and just like all the experimentation around what works, what doesn't work, what we've learned so far, and maybe what we've learned from other people as well, right? Which I think is super important at this stage, no?
Exactly. Yeah, I mean, we want to talk about what we're doing with Asia Tech Podcast, why we're doing it, what we've learned, and also, what our plans are for the future. But I think before we do that, it's kind of important for us to pay a bit of homage, a bit of respect to the people that have blazed the trail before us. So that there are podcasts out there in Asia, especially in the tech space, which we've got to pay a bit of respect to. And I think we shout those out first because all of these guys we're going to mention now are coming on our show, which I think is fantastic. I mean, that just shows the sort of attitude in this space that there's a big cake that everybody can take a share of, right? Rather than, it's sort of a win-lose proposition. Everybody help each other out. So we have, just listing here, there's 5 hosts who are coming on Asia Tech Podcast over the next couple of weeks. We've got Matt Brennan from China Tech Talk. He's going to talk about WeChat and social media in China, everything we need to know. I mean, that's such a hot topic altogether. I mean, that's not just one podcast. That's a regular series of podcasts. Bernard Leong, Analyze Asia. You're going to be on his show as well, Michael, I believe, right?
I am. I'm looking forward to it, actually, quite a bit.
Excellent. Jay Kim from the Jay Kim Show will be on our shows shortly. Mike from Global from Asia, just more focused on the e-commerce side of things. And Tim Romero here in Japan, Disrupt Japan, all going to be on Asia Tech Podcast. Wow, and these guys have been at it for a while, right? Yeah, some of them are more recent, but I think all of them have been at it longer than us. So, we've been at it for 6 months, right? So I think it's great. There's a growing audience of podcast listeners out there in Asia. And, there's so many different angles to cover. A lot of these are very specific on specific regions or specific, whether they're talking about e-commerce or China specifically. Or Japan. Exactly. Look, it seems to me that, like you said earlier, there is a pie out there, but the pie is not fixed, right? So if you enter other industries, you're really talking about there's sort of a fixed amount of exposure and pie you can get. And then you have to take it away from somebody else. You have to take market share. We used to do this in my old business, right? What market share are we taking away from somebody else to benefit our business? And in this case, I think that just the fact that everybody is coming on our shows and that we're being invited to go on their show, right? Like you said, I'm going to be on Bernard's show, which I'm really looking forward to. It just means that there's not really competition per se. It's just that there's enough out there for everybody to participate in. And it's more helping other people grow their business in the same way that we're trying to grow this platform. And the question for me, one of the questions I'd love to ask the rest of these podcasters, and we can ask ourselves is, what's the point, right? What are we trying to accomplish? What's the purpose for building this platform, right? And I have my own ideas. I'd love to hear, just say what you're thinking, and I'll say what I'm thinking too. And it's like I actually had someone thank me twice today, right? I did a bunch of interviews today and had 2 people thank me and say, I really want to thank you for allowing me to participate on this platform. Because it gives that's part of what the story is. Anyway, I'm curious for your feedback on that. Yeah, and before I answer the question, that whole thing about the platform as well, this is audio. It seems to be slightly contradicting where we're going with the whole media landscape. This is audio, it's radio effectively, isn't it, for the internet age? You
It
know,
is.
how is that still surviving? Why are people paying attention to radio and stories and people talking and audio in a world where it seems that people, the listeners or the viewer's attention span is 8 seconds. We live in a world of clickbait headlines, BuzzFeed, but we're pushing out hour-long interviews, really in-depth interviews with people.
Sure.
So, that really has to answer the why question, isn't it? You say, why are people doing this? There has to be something that all of that very much, that superficial media landscape is not catering for. People really want to get in depth into stories and find out more about people. That's what I believe. I believe it's storytelling.
Yeah, I completely agree with you. And I think there's a fatigue. I think there's link bait fatigue. I think there's 8-second update fatigue. I think people really want to, in the same way people still enjoy curling up and reading a book, they like to listen to a discussion. I don't think people like to be yelled at on the internet any more than they like to be yelled at in person. And I think what most people really want to do is they use podcasting as a way to escape a little bit into a topic that really interests them, right? And people always say, okay, are you going to, and I heard people talking about this today, are you going to pivot to video?
Wow.
And, well, we will do video, and I think video is an important part of what we will do going forward. But you cannot watch video when you're driving, okay? And you can't watch video when you're lying in bed next to your partner because that video flickers and it may keep somebody awake. But what you can do is listening to headphoned audio. And in the same way that television did not kill radio, because people couldn't watch television when they were driving their car to work or sitting on the bus or sitting on a train. And I don't think necessarily that video on the internet will kill audio podcasting. I think there's a place for both things. But the point is, what's the reason to tell those stories? Well, here's the reason. And I think Jeffrey Handley, I spoke to Jeffrey today, and you'll hear his interview later on ATP Stories. But one of the things that Jeffrey said was really good is a lot we take for granted because we exist in a certain ecosystem that the entire world knows what we know, or at least has a similar perspective. The reality is that what we want to do with this podcast is give exposure to people and to topics that may not, because again, they're really busy, they may not have the exposure that they want or need to tell their story. And whether that story requires them to get investment money or just get mentors from the right place, or literally just tell people what their story is over a period of time, this is a platform that gives them the opportunity to do that. And they may not have that opportunity otherwise. And for me, that's one of the biggest reasons to build this platform. Obviously, we want to build a business that's big and vibrant because the bigger it is and the more vibrant it is, the more effective that storytelling will be. But at its core, for me, it's really got to be a way to tell the stories of people, inside an ecosystem. And for us, that ecosystem is Asia.
Yeah, and audio as the choice format for that is interesting, isn't it? I know you talk about that whole pivot to video thing, how important audio is, because now that we're talking, we're just focusing on the voice, right?
Right.
And if you have video, you can easily dress that up. You can put all the effects and the bottom thirds and all that kind of stuff in, and you can easily detract away from the story. But if you're talking, there's not a lot you can do to dress that up. It's raw. And I think that's the appeal. And you said that TV didn't kill off radio. Maybe that is why, because it has that ability to tell a story which is maybe unadulterated. It's unedited. It's raw. And that's what people are really seeking. Something, I suppose, authentic is the word I'm looking for here, that people are looking for in a world which is easy to dress up and easy to fake.
Sure. Look, I can do all the CGI you want in video, and I can give you a completely immersive experience in VR or AR or MR, right, the mixed reality. But what I can't do is I cannot allow your imagination to run wild. And I think what you do, if you have powerful enough audio, the conversations themselves are compelling enough. I think growing a podcast network is really about giving people enough information so that their imagination is still powerful enough to let them presume and sort of fill in the gaps for what you're talking about, right? And that whole concept of allowing people's imaginations to run wild is only really possible with an audio-only podcast. Now, like I said, we will do video in the case where we want people to see what other people look like, or look at a demonstration, or understand a deeper context. But the reality is, again, I had an amazing conversation, or a few of them today, with people, and the fact that it was audio only forced me, and in a way allowed me to think through with my own imagination, where were they? Okay, so I don't get to see, right in my mind, I was talking to somebody who sits in an accelerator. Well, were all of the sort of portfolio companies around them, when they mentioned a portfolio company that did the AR stuff or that did I was picturing what that would look like. Right. And for me, that part of the storytelling is really powerful. Right, and I think it's endemic. I think it's inside all humans, right? That power of the imagination. And I think when you remove it a little bit, you remove, that power inside the brain to remember things as well. I think a conversation that you hear is way more powerful, particularly at this level, than having somebody feed in their imagination of what a scenario is supposed to look like, right? So for me, that's part of why we're doing this type of stuff with audio. Because what are we going to do? You and I could be sitting at a desk with 3 cameras and have a conversation, but it's really just people looking at you and me. But I don't want to be the focus of the conversation, as ridiculously handsome as I am, which is sarcasm, by the way. But
we'll see. We'll see when we actually got a video.
Exactly.
Let the viewers decide.
The crowd will not be cheering. Let's just say that. But the point is that people are focused more on the conversation. What are they talking about? Why are they talking about that? What do I understand about what they're saying? I think that's the best way to build a following, because people will understand the conversation itself is really compelling because the voice in which it's given ends up being compelling, right? And I think, you and I may have been talking about this online or offline, right? But I'm sure you've heard, as we started and sort of get deep into this concept of ATP stories, I'm sure you've heard people say to you, well, that's the best interview I've done in a while. And the reason why is because you're really good at listening and then finding that hook, finding that nugget inside the conversation and then focusing on that. And that's an important way to not just build the business, but build the rapport.
Yeah.
Right? And building that rapport is really key to building the following, I think. No?
Yeah, exactly. Let's talk about some of those conversations that we've had with ATP Stories, because what are we now? We're about a month into ATP Stories, and we've done, I think, looking at the stats, we've recorded 35 interviews. We've been pretty hammer and tong at it for the last couple of weeks. We've only actually published 10 yet, but it's been fascinating, some of the things that we have learned in that period. We've seen a really diverse range of, or listened to a diverse range of stories. We've had everybody from, the big corporates. We've had Coca-Cola on the show. We've had ex-ambassadors to, Southeast Asia on the show. We've had all the way down to single-man startups. So it's been really interesting. What kind of things have we learned? Can we share some of the gems, some of the nuggets from those stories that really stood out for you?
Yeah, I mean, I don't want to have what I call a sort of the flaw of proximity or closeness, right? But today was amazing, and I say this to you. You know this. I say this every day, really. But I was able to talk to Steve Rogan today, right? So he's the vice chairman of the American Chamber of Commerce in Asia.
And you're still buzzing from that conversation. That was 7 in the morning, right?
It was really early this morning. But besides the fact that he was an extremely compelling speaker, super eloquent at a level that embarrassed me, because I thought, how am I going to keep up with this level of eloquence? And I mean that seriously. Remember, he's not on the phone now, so it's not like I'm blowing smoke in the wrong place. But the point is that we talked about things that I hadn't considered, right? Venture philanthropy, a term that I had never heard before. And his view on what social impact investing is, what's your real impact? Again, was just really, it just made me rethink the way that I was had conceptualized impact investing. But it wasn't the only thing, right? And that wasn't the only interview that we've done where I've had to rethink the way I've been conceptualizing certain concepts. We continue to get people like that. I feel every day is either just as good, if not better, than the previous day. But learning those types of things, again, is the whole point of doing this. And that is giving exposure, creating a platform where people can talk about things that are really compelling in Asia, right? He and I actually talked about TPP. So what is it? The Trans-Pacific Partnership. What it meant. What is a multilateral agreement between nations? Or is it more important, or is it less important than a bilateral agreement? Right? I mean, there's no such thing as a unilateral agreement. But that this morning alone...
Michael, put it into context. This guy isn't just a commentator on TPP, right?
No. Well, no. I mean, he participated in the negotiations of TPP, and his career actually started in the White House, back in the late 80s and actually in the 90s. And that's insanely interesting to me, right? So again, part of the reason for starting this was just to get to talk to the most interesting people in Asia, and whether that's a startup or an investor, like you said, a one-person startup, a 1,500-person startup, or just an investor who's essentially, like I said, I spoke to Jeffrey Hanley today. Jeffrey's family's from New Zealand, but he was born in Hong Kong. He lived most of his life in China. He started a business with his brothers back in New Zealand. They had ended up with somewhere between 15 and 20 offices for that. They had a trade sale and an exit that was interesting, but that they actually conceptualized themselves. Like all these things that you learn, I think, from a building the platform perspective, you couldn't buy this information anywhere. So the whole point, right, is to be able to take all the information and to be able to synthesize it down into these hour-long conversations, and then make sure that they're all compelling enough and interesting enough for other people to listen to.
Yeah. Is that enough simply to interview people for an hour, and just find interesting people and interview them and just do that week in, week out?
No.
Or do we have to think about, there has to be a bigger purpose here. There has to be leading towards something. Because I'm thinking of people who may be listening to this and thinking, yeah, I want to do something like that as well. It's all very well just getting the content and sharing that, but where is that going?
Well, you tell me. I mean, what do you think? You've done a ton of these interviews as well, right? So you and I have a weekly where we just go back and forth and we talk to each other about things that we think are interesting. But one of the interesting decisions that we made at the beginning of the stories was, let's not interview people together, because we kind of talked on top of each other and it wasn't creating sort of the best type of content or interaction. But what do you think with the interviews that you've done as well? Like, how do you see this either differently or the same that I see it?
Yeah, I mean, I see everybody that we're interviewing now as, like, these are our fans, and building a fan base of people in Asia, right? I'm completely focused, like working hard with Jenny. So anybody that's touched this podcast has had some kind of interaction with Jenny, who's, our tireless assistant production manager, and trying to create the best possible experience, because it's all very well creating a podcast, but I believe that everybody that comes on the podcast, in that build up to the podcast and after the podcast, it's so important to create an amazing experience, as you would, if you're a retail company or you're an e-commerce company, you're completely focused on that experience. So that's what I think that we have to do, is that have that experience at the forefront of what we're doing, because it's so easy to do an interview and then it just drops off. That's the end of that interview. On to the next interview. Or it's so easy just to hit, do the interview. That's the first interaction you have with that person. But if you can create an experience around that, that sort of then turns it from being a one-off event to this ongoing relationship. Because I look at everybody that we do a podcast interview with as somebody that potentially we're building a long-term relationship with. Right. This is really a beginning. Learn about them, and it's a starting point. Create something with them. Because if you can create something with that person, that never goes away. It's not just like having a meeting. And interestingly, you and I, the genesis of our relationship was a podcast, right?
It was.
In a different life. Exactly. And this came out of that in a way. So I see it from that context. And I think you've got to have a system to support that, but you've got to have that mindset, go into it thinking these are all potential relationships. These should all be leading somewhere.
Right, but what does that mean? So if you're creating sort of a group of connected relationships, for lack of a better word, I mean, one of the things we're also trying to do is just create a community of interested people. Right, so the big question for me going forward is, how do you keep that community vibrant, right? In other words, what do we do after we interview somebody? What do we do after we produce a podcast to keep that community sort of cogent and coherent and keep everybody together, where actually everybody becomes a resource for everybody else, right? We talked earlier about the 5 other people that are doing podcasts and how we're going to cross-reference them and sort of cross-podcast on each one of theirs. So they come onto ours, we go onto theirs, and how that helps build that community. But once that's done, how do we go out and build that community to a point where everybody, it's sort of self-feeding, right? And it feeds off itself. In other words, for every 100 people that we podcast with, they must know 100 people. I don't like the term necessarily virality. But then how do we get all those people to listen to us and sort of support us and support the creation of that platform that then gives other people exposure. So the more people that are on it and the more vibrant it is, the more exposure is, right, that the individual sort of people that we interview will get out of it. And for me, so the genesis of this whole idea was, as an investor, right, how do we take the community of investments and even potential investments? We don't make every investment we see, and we don't necessarily, invest in every company. But how do we sort of not promote necessarily, but how do we give those companies exposure outside their region, right? And it's sort of self-fulfilling in the sense that if you see a good company, whether you invest in it or not, how do you get the rest of the world, the rest of the region, even the rest of your town to know about it? I think the best way to do that is to create a media platform to allow them to do it. And I think one of the discussions that you and I had early was, well, we live in a really unique time period where, 10, 15 years ago, not that long ago, it would literally cost $1 billion to buy a bunch of existing media assets, right? And a bunch of legacy systems, or whether it's really expensive television cameras or broadcasting rights in either local or any region. And today, the barriers to entry are really just, they're de minimis. A few laptops, some microphones, and just a really, really good idea and a super strong brain, right? And with that in hand, we decided, let's go out and build this thing. And I think so far, with very little marketing, we haven't even talked about how you market a podcast. We've really just talked about how we get people interested in it. I do think there's another level to get to, right? I mean, what do you think about that? Like, how do you get it to the next level? How do you get more than just people that are listening to you naturally to listen to it and discover you?
Yeah, that's the challenge, isn't it? That's where you have to sort of step outside. It's easy to get into what we're doing and just keep doing that. And we could be doing this week in, week out, which is fine. But if you want to take it to the next level, what do you got to do?
Right.
And I think this is, this is I suppose we're doubling down on our community, and we're going to go out and do this tour. And this is interesting because, the podcast medium, which we're doing virtually, okay, we've met some of these people before and we'll meet a number of these people afterwards on the tour. But what we're deciding to do is go out and actually go to these places, meet the people, host live events in these cities around Southeast Asia. And I think, I'm a great believer in offline as a real driver for online online sharing, online content, online marketing, everything. I think if you just focus on the online stuff, you can really miss out. If you look at everybody talks about how successful Apple was as an example of a marketing case study. What people kind of gloss over in that story is how important the offline element was that for Apple. It's the retail store that made Apple. So I think for us, it's the same. We've just got to get out. We've got to get out and touch real people. And I don't know if it's the appropriate analogy, but I see this in the context of being a band or a rock group. And you're doing great music. You're putting together great albums, but you're really still at sort of the early stages. What do you do? And what any good band or group would do is get out, get on the bus, and tour. And do every single city, every single state, and even in this day and age, with all the digital assets that the labels have, that's what rock groups are still doing. They still have to go out there and touch people's lives in the analog world. So I feel, I think we've got to double down on that.
I agree. I mean, this is one of the innovations of our podcast, and that is we can, you're in Japan and I'm in Thailand, right? And we can sit here and very easily just continue to go on and do it like this. But I think what we're finding is there's a really big interest in getting us to get out of our chairs and leave our comfort zones and go to places that we've talked about, right? We did this, right? So on the Asia Tech podcast, you and I were just discussing what makes a great startup city.
Yeah.
And we actually did 2 episodes on it. And then we said to ourselves while we were broadcasting, I think, wait a second. We can pontificate, but we really did that, right? We can.
Is that how it happened? I don't remember now.
I don't remember. I think either you said it or I said it, or we kind of said it together, which is generally how things work with us. And that was, wait a second. I've been to Singapore before. I've been to Fukuoka. Where else? I've been to Jakarta. I've been in Vietnam, but I haven't been in Ho Chi Minh in 20 years, right? So it's important for me to go there. And I've been in other Asian cities. The only place I've never been that's on the list is Yangon. So that should be fascinating. But I think we were just having a discussion. We said, wait a second. We can guess what makes a great startup city, or we can just go to that city and ask the people that are there directly in a group or individually and say, what makes a great startup city? You tell us. And then, accumulate all that information, and then we go out again and we talk about it from that city live. I don't think any other podcast has done that, and I think that's true actually globally. Is that fair to say? In other words, what's your favorite podcast? I've got a bunch of them, right?
Yeah. I mean, the podcasts I've mentioned already, I actively listen to and I think are great. And I have a lot of interest outside of tech as well. I mean, I love listening to people who, obviously have little connection to tech as well. I mean, just today, I was listening to Joe Rogan. And Joe Rogan, he produces like these 3-hour epics, which just go around the houses and talk about all different kinds of things. And, it's a hit or miss. But I think it goes back to that point about the reason why people, and he has a huge following.
Never even heard of him, really?
Yeah, exactly. I think he was an ex-MMA guy, an ex-mixed martial artist, fighter.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
And he's doing these podcasts and he's talking about everything from, the politics to society and everything. He has all different kinds of guests on there. But the reason why I think it's so popular is people want people to go really deep and really long and not be contained by this short, this narrow band medium that we live in, this world that we live in, where you've got a short attention span and so on. So that was really interesting, And if you can go back, I'll listen to Howard Stern, because I think, for me, his mic technique is amazing. I think, he's done some ridiculous stuff in his time, but when he actually does interview people, I don't think there's anybody that can interview people as well as him. When he's on a good subject and he doesn't have all the weirdos in the studio, which seem to he is distracted over the years.
He seems to have a lot of weirdos. I don't know that.
But as an interviewer, he is just amazing. I think he's got it. So I love listening to those guys because I love people who can really get deep down and you talked about it earlier. The hook can find that human angle, whether it's talking to somebody who is a politician or somebody in technology. It's all about human stories, right? What about yourself? Which ones do you listen to?
Oh, I mean, to me, it's like all tech, right? So it's because your interests actually diverge quite a bit from mine, whether it's the Iron Man things that you do, or just all the survival things, and how to run a small business and succeed, how to retire before you're 40 years old, all that kind of stuff, right? For me, it's all finance and tech, and it's the things that I've always been interested in. I like listening to the talk show with John Gruber, which is just, as he calls it, the director's cut for the Daring Fireball side, right? I listened to a podcast that Marco Arment is on, and Marco's one of the original guys. He was actually the original employee at Tumblr, so he wrote a lot of the original code on the Tumblr site, where he was working with the founder, whose last name I can't remember, but first name is David something. I was bought by Yahoo. John Siracusa does something called Hypercritical, which I used to listen to, and now he works with Marco Arment on the podcast. But he has a really unique perspective on all things tech, and again, super detailed. So maybe I just talk my own position, right? But I love listening to that kind of stuff. It also gives me ideas. It also gives me a perspective on what I talk to. And obviously, I love listening to This Week in Startups, right? It's something that's really close to me. I mean, I talk about it a lot offline, and I should talk about it online as well, right? The stuff that Jason Calacanis and his team does, not just because of the fact that they've made some insanely great investments, but the guests that they have on their show are really compelling for me. I learn a lot, right? Mm-hmm. And one of the things that I've been able to do is connect to some of those guests. I actually did this last night, right? So I heard one of the guests talk about their business. It's called Genius Link. And what Genius Link does is Genius Link takes a lot of the backlinks that are on your thing, and they use it as a marketing tool. But they also take all of the information that backlink gives you, and then they feed it back to you. Any information that they can get from something that someone's linked to you, right? They'll go and they'll get that information and they'll share it at cost, right, to some of the startups and also some of the e-commerce sites. It's a really interesting business. And what I did was I actually reached out after listening to that podcast. I reached out to the founder of that company. I connected to him, and I, in the end, ended up connecting him because my view on this is in reverse. And this is, again, one of the reasons and one of the ways to grow this and why we're trying to grow it is how can we connect what's going on in the United States and in Europe to what's going on in Asia.
Yeah.
And my first conversation with him went something like this. So I see that you're growing really quickly in the United States. Have you considered, the fact that there are 630 million people in Southeast Asia? And his first answer was, yeah, I'm just going to focus on the U.S. first. And he caught himself in the middle and said, how many people again?
Yeah. Exactly.
Again, when you're in a vortex, right, you lose sight of what's going on around you. And again, just to get back to it, that's the point of doing this, of building this platform, is to remove people from the vortex. And I want to do it both ways, and I think you do too, and that is to not just give exposure to people in this region to outside the region, but to give people outside the region exposure into here. And once you have that platform can be used for some of the most powerful connectivity things you can imagine. And like I said, we interviewed, who was it you were mentioning before we started talking? Don Fan, right? So he runs Mbe.
Yeah.
It's a baby site. And one of the largest sort of baby sites in the world, right? So in Vietnam, sorry. Yeah. So somebody sort of, you published that, somebody listened to it. It's been one of our most listened to podcasts. One of my venture capital friends in the United States said to me, hey, I'd like to meet that person. And I connected them. That's the effectiveness. And that's sort of what's going to lead to growth, is that if people believe that they can learn things and be exposed to things to which they would not otherwise be exposed, they'll continue to listen. And I think that's part of what we talked about earlier about building the community. Yeah, right. Yeah. So I guess it's a long-winded answer about what do I listen to? I listen to things that really interest me, right? And the tech is something that I've been doing, really since I was in high school. And I used it all throughout my career at Morgan Stanley and Goldman Sachs or whatever, at Citigroup as well. And people that know me from those other roles will corroborate that. But just fast forward to today, and that's the type of podcasting that I listen to, right? But also, and I think this is really important to note, I also listen to Bill Simmons, right? So Bill Simmons runs something that used to be called Grantland, and now he runs something called The Ringer. And what he figured out was that having a discussion, so writing an article is really cool. And Bill Simmons was really famous for writing very long form, 3,000, 4,000 word articles on sports. And he was famous for taking sports and putting it in the context of culture, pop culture. But one of the things he realized was that you can actually have more of a conversation on a podcast than you can have in an article. I can quote people in written form, and the written form actually is never going to go away. It's really powerful when you're trying to make a very specific point, and in other cases as well. But what a podcast allows you to do is it's participatory. Right? I get to ask you questions. You get to ask me questions. It's a conversation. And then if people listen to that conversation, we get feedback all the time. I got feedback today from somebody in Indonesia saying, you should talk about this particular topic, right? Yeah. So they loved that conversation that we had about Amazon and buying Whole Foods. And they said, okay, well, how about Alibaba, right? Buying Lazada, which we also talked about. But Alibaba also made a big investment in Tokopedia. So are they competing with themselves? It's another marketplace. Like, what do you think the significance of that is? But I got that feedback today from somebody who listened. And that's the whole point about growing this, right? Is that how do you continue that conversation, like you said, offline? Because I got that feedback. I mean, obviously I got it in email, but it's not on the podcast.
Yeah. Really interesting, Michael. There's a number of points you bring up there. I just want to sort of backtrack on some of those. That the whole thing about how do you appeal to the outside world, outside of Asia. And I think it's also dovetails nicely into the whole thing about, creating the conversation, because I want to bring in, to sort of answer this, there's a conversation that we had. It was one of the earlier podcasts that all three of us were on, which was with Ned Phillips.
Yeah, Ned, that was a great one, actually.
Yeah, the reason why I bring that one up is because, in a way, there's a point at which the podcast just went completely off on a tangent talking. And the background here is both Ned and Michael worked in tech and trading and the investment banking side of the world. And that's probably about as much as most people know about all of that. But then you guys just went off and started talking about, I don't know, dark pools and Chi-X or whatever, and all that stuff. And it was like, what was interesting about that? I mean, I could have literally, I could have just sort of hung up and said, right, this is just way above my head. But there is something, isn't it? When you have two people really passionate about something, really into something, and they then start talking about it, regardless of what the actual domain knowledge is or what the content is that if somebody's passionate about something and there's a conversation going on, that is attractive. And I think that's kind of like going back to that conversation about how do you get outside world interested in Asia. I think the key is not necessarily to make ourselves, to edit our content to be appealing to the outside world. It's just to be really passionate about the stories that we're focusing on, right? And just be the best at trying to make those stories interesting and exciting and really getting deep down on those. And rather than thinking, oh, will this appeal to these people or these people? Because they'll come and they'll think, wow, this is really interesting. These people are really into this. They must be onto something, right?
Right.
So I think there's more kind of conversations like that Ned Phillips ones. And I'm still looking at my notes and thinking, what the hell were these guys?
Were they talking? But you make a really good point, right? No, it was super, right? And remember, that whole conversation started with you guys talking about the triathlon the Ironman in Hawaii, and how do you get into it, right? But remember, think about this. We talked about online to offline, right, or offline to online, and how those things compare. Think about yourself being at a party with like 25 people, and you're standing there talking to your wife or to your girlfriend or to your buddy, and you look across the room, and there are two people that are so engrossed in a conversation, and they're very passionate. You look over, and you'll stop your own conversation, look across the room, and just think, I wonder what they're talking about.
Exactly.
And if you're actually really adventurous, you'll walk over and just try to listen in, because it's just they're so passionate about it. And I think that's part of the point that you're trying to make, is that when you sign on to a podcast, it's rare that it's just one person talking. It's either one or two other people talking, right? So it's two or three people. And if they're not into it, you'll just hit the pause button and you'll listen to something else.
Yeah. That's difficult though, isn't it? I mean, I think a lot of people are used to, I know, I'm trying to find the right words, a corporate approach. I mean, podcasts are almost like PR to some people, aren't they? And, like you would write a press release, 99% of press releases are just terrible because they're edited down to offend nobody, right?
Right.
They're meaningless. They're everything to everybody, not something to somebody. And that conversation with Ned Phillips, half the people listening here today, if they go back and listen to that conversation, it's not published yet, but it's out soon. Half of the people think, what is going on here? I don't understand. But half the people think, this sounds really interesting. I'm into this. Some of them may have some kind of hook into investment banking. Some of them may just hang around because it's interesting. So I don't think you ever sort of approach it from the angle of like, okay, well, maybe some people aren't interested in learning about trading systems and stuff like that. Therefore, maybe we just kind of avoid that subject and stick to the middle of the road. That's the problem, isn't it? That's the challenge that we face in all of this, is that, that's the temptation, because when you want to get mass, you have to kind of edit yourself down a little bit. So that's the challenge that we're facing. But I think we're doing all right so far. And,
yeah, I think so. I think so. And I
maybe
think
that comes down from not really caring about what people think about us.
But it's also the idea that, we talk about this a lot, like how much of this is actually scripted.
Yeah.
Well, none of it, really.
We've got three bullet points.
Maybe, right? But what we do is we kind of pick a topic, something that interests you, something that interests me, or something that interests both of us, and we just kind of run with it. Yeah. And the idea is we can't talk about something with passion, which means we can't expose that passion to other people unless we really care about the topic at hand, right? I mean, look, how many episodes did we do on women in tech? And it was only halfway through the first one where we said there's not enough time to finish this. We have to do another one. And frankly, we could have done more. The reality is that we could do almost an entire vertical on it. And I think that's one of the other realizations that we're having, is that the more passionate we are about any individual topic, the more likely it is to branch out into its own vertical. For, I don't want to give away the store really, but I will say this. The conversation that I have with Jeffrey Hanley today convinced me that we need to spend a lot more time talking to him and about his vision and his thesis for the fund that he's starting, right? Because there's a big idea around it, and that big idea requires more than an hour's worth of time. And I think we find that the best conversations we have lead us to think, wait a second, if we really want to build this into something larger and we want to build a real community and community support around it, it's those big overriding topics and themes that are really going to keep people interested. And that's one of the keys to growth, I think.
Where do we go from here? Obviously, we've got the tour coming up starting this Saturday, this Sunday, right? We're off on the weekend. And if you haven't found out about the tour yet, if you're interested in meeting up in one of the cities that we'll be touring to in Asia, will be at asiatechpodcast.com/tour. Where does it go from here? We're going to be on the road for, the best part of 6 or 7 weeks.
Yeah, I think it's about 2 months, right?
Right.
Where does it go from here? Here's where I think it goes, and I think it's pretty obvious based on the things we've already done and the things we've already accomplished. I think what ends up happening is we get people to get interested in those individual cities, and I don't think that interest dies. And like we said earlier, the reality is that the more we talk to each other and the more we talk to other people, the more we become like really focused on the topics that matter to us and that matter to others. And I think what happens is we go to those cities. We're going to be in Fukuoka first, right? And that's going to be an immersive exposure for us and also for people that listen to us about what the startup scene is like in Japan, right? And you live in Japan. I lived in Tokyo for years, and I also traveled. I basically drove the entire country. I like doing that. I mean, what most people don't know is that 20 years ago, I did the same thing in Thailand. So I drove from Bangkok without really any aids except a paper map from here all the way up to Chiang Rai, and then actually to the border of what was then called Burma, but what's now Myanmar, right? And I like doing that drive. And again, it's a metaphor for the tour that we're taking, right? Because unless you go through the entire country, you really don't get a sense for that country's differences. And what we're going to find out is that Fukuoka itself has a very different vibe than Tokyo has. Yeah. Because of that, they're not just their desire to attract startups there, but their ability to do that, I think, will only be obvious once we get there. Right. And I think it also because, when you visit somebody's house, you become either super close or friends with them or they really despise you because they don't know what you're like, what your behavior is going to be like. And I think part of the goal is also to go there and to meet friends and to get those friends as supporters. And I think that visiting each one of those cities and then each one of those countries is going to go a long way to helping to grow this platform, because getting back to verticals, it'll allow us to then say, not only do we think we know something about Fukuoka in Japan, but we've actually been there and we've built a rapport with the people that are there, and they can help us going forward to continue to learn about those places. And I think that actual continuation of learning is what helps grow the platform as well. No?
Yeah. Which cities are you particularly looking forward to? Putting you on the spot a little bit here because,
No, not at all.
Because we've got, let's just quickly run through for the listeners where we're going. Fukuoka, then Shanghai. Then, is it Yangon next? Myanmar? Or Saigon? Saigon or Ho Chi Minh City in Vietnam. Yeah. Yangon, Myanmar. Not necessarily in this order, but more or less. In this order. Bangkok, Jakarta, then probably Singapore, Hong Kong. The order's obviously open to change, but most of those we've been to before. Is there any particularly that, you get excited about going to now? Of all of those cities, which one do you think would be the most interesting in terms of the learning experience? You're talking about as a learning experience, going there and maybe having some of your expectations challenged because it may have been a while since you've been there last time.
Yeah, so for me, Fukuoka is a secondary city in Japan. It may actually be, it's not third tier, but it's definitely a secondary city. And if you talk to foreigners and you say, we're going to go do a podcast in Fukuoka, they may not even know what country it's in, right? So for me, but I think it's a fair commentary, right? I think that's one of the reasons why the Startup Cafe, Fukuoka Startup City, why all these things become really important. So for me, it'll be the first time going back to Japan in a long time where there's like a super strong business reason to be there, and that business reason is different from the business reasons I've had in the past, right? As opposed to looking at this as, how are large institutional investors going to perceive the investment of, not just Tokyo itself, but Japanese companies and then Asian stock listed companies. The question for me is, why is this not happening in Tokyo? And could it happen in Tokyo? But maybe not. So I have a view on why this is happening in Fukuoka. So that's really exciting to me. But let's move on a little bit because it's a great question. I was in Vietnam for the first and last time, in 1991 or 1992, I can't remember. And remember, back then, Americans were not allowed to directly travel because relations between the United States of America and Vietnam were not normalized since the fall of Saigon in 1975. Okay, now I don't know exactly when that changed. Maybe it was the Clinton. No, it couldn't have been Clinton. I don't know when that changed. But even back then, when I flew into Saigon, they couldn't stamp my passport. They'd sort of stapled something in, and they removed that stapled piece of paper when I left, like I'd never been there before. So,
well, you were actually chronologically, you were closer to the fall of Saigon, right, than you are
than I am today, for sure.
Exactly.
Easily. Was that 1975 to 1991? It was only 16 years. Is that right? 16 years. Yeah. So now I'm like 26 years away from the last time that I was there. So that to me is going to be fascinating. There was no chance that there was going to be startups there, large tech companies there, even American manufacturing there. The entire thing has changed, right? So the bit has completely flipped. And like I said, I haven't been there since, so it's not like I have any relationship with it at all. I do know tons of people that live there, but like we said, there's nothing like going there to find out. And Yangon, right? Like, I could probably walk to Myanmar in like 5 days if I did it fast enough. And I was once over the border, right? So I did, like I said, I drove to the...
That was up north. I was in the Triangle, right?
Yep. I drove to the Golden Triangle once, and that was in 1998. And I stepped over the border. And to do that, I think I might have mentioned this on another podcast. Obviously not in Yangon, but just over the border, gave my passport to a border guard, and I literally was the most scared I've been for 15 minutes. And I'm not sure if that's more a comment on me or a comment on Myanmar at the time, but it's probably a combination of both.
It was a different world, though. I mean, come on.
Completely.
I mean, it was a military junta, wasn't it, when you went?
Yeah, and it was like it was not a nice place, at least in my mind. I mean, again, my perception and reality are two completely different things. But to go back now in the context of it being a startup city, I just cannot wait to go. Right, so places like Singapore and Hong Kong, I'm excited to go, but I've been there so often, not just in the past 5 years, but in the past 25 years. And I've been there in the context of startup cities as well. But I think now with the real goal of, actually looking deeper into it, I'll learn something more. But really, it's, Ho Chi Minh or Saigon, Yangon, and Fukuoka that really super excite me because there's just so much more for me to learn there.
These are the real frontier markets, like the frontier cities, so to speak. I mean, especially when you talk about, everybody talks about Myanmar, but to actually get in there now and to see what's happened, that's going to be really exciting.
Do you want to talk a little bit about Shanghai and why that happened? Because I think that's interesting, if nothing else.
Like, we haven't mentioned it.
No, not at all. And I think in the context of, we said at the beginning of this, we're going to talk about how do we grow the podcast, how do we grow the platform. You want to spend a little bit of time talking about what Shanghai actually means to us and why we're going?
Right. So we're off to Shanghai on the 4th of September, right? So that's 2 weeks' time. We're going there as the guests of our friends at Huawei, which is pretty much the biggest Chinese manufacturing company out there, right? So, we're going there to... I suppose we're going there to learn about Huawei, and we're going there to, get to know the people of Huawei better. We're going to be there for their big Connect event, which is going to be on the 5th, 6th, and 7th.
Right.
So and we're going there as Asia Tech Podcast. So they basically connected with us and said, hey, love what you do in Asia Tech Podcast. Please come to our event. We'd love to have you here, and we'd love to have you here as a media partner to, talk to our people as well. So that's really a stepping stone for us. That's a step up from what we've been doing. Obviously, that's the first time we're actually out there as a guest of a company like Huawei. But also, it's the first time that we've really been invited to an event like that. So that's a start. We've consciously made the decision to go out and seek these things now. But that's a starting point for us. So I think that's a really interesting development because that will be one of many, I suppose, in the future, that we could be attending.
Yeah, I mean, to be fair, one of the things about creating great content and having great guests is that it gives us exposure into companies like Huawei and other large companies like this that want to have sort of modern coverage of their events. I mean, and the concept that they've introduced us is that they have a group of people that they call key opinion leaders, KOLs, and they want you and me to be one of their or two of their key opinion leaders, and they don't have tons of them, right? I think 25 of them. I don't remember exactly what the number is, so I could be exaggerating that low to make myself feel better for sure. But the bottom line is that for us at this stage of development in the life of our podcasting to be invited by Huawei to Shanghai to participate in one of their benchmark events, right, is just really exciting. And that's one of the ways, again, it just proves the concept. Do good things, create great content, have great partners, and more partners will come and seek you out. And I think, the team at Huawei has noticed and has been super helpful to us. And I think we'll continue, hopefully, if we don't do anything stupid, which we haven't done so far.
Yeah.
I would
you
say
worry
that
about speaking your mind?
No, not really, because, I think Walter, right, has told us, come do what you've been doing, really. Help give us a little bit of exposure, but, we don't want to overdo anything. We really want you to see what we do and get better exposure to what our company is like. I mean, what does Huawei spend on R&D every year? What is it, $9-10 billion? I don't think most people know that.
Exactly.
Right?
I mean, they're a back office company, really, aren't they? They operate in the background. I mean, people know the brand, but really the business is behind the terminals. That's where they make their money, right? All the enterprise side of things. So.
Well, they run the pipes of the Chinese internet.
Yeah.
That's a big deal, right? And just to be, I was joking with Jeffrey Hanley this morning, one of the phrases you see on LinkedIn all the time is, I'm honored and humbled in a context where there's no honor or no humility. But the reality is that we are honored, actually. We're super happy to have been noticed by a company this large. And to get invited to something like this, again, you said, what am I excited about that we're going to be doing? I'm super excited about this. I could not be more excited about it, actually, because this is just the beginning of what hopefully for us will be a long-term relationship with a company of the stature of Huawei.
Yeah.
And to grow this thing in a way that's just exponential, right? So I think that's going to be really important.
And it's interesting, isn't it? I mean, without naming names, there's been a number of companies that we're having conversations with or contacted us, and you would have thought that they have all this fixed, locked down. These are media companies or large IT companies or consultancies who are talking to us and saying, hey, look, we love what you're doing. Is there any sort of way that we can have a bit of that in our network, right? Because they're not doing this stuff, right? I mean, they have PR, they have blogs, they have video, but they don't have anybody who has that long-form content, that bandwidth to go and really get deep down on these stories. And I think people are realizing it now. It's because it seems to be people from the communication side of the world that are coming to us, right?
Exactly.
And saying, hey, how do we have a piece of this, right? Because it's easy for them to say, right, okay, we could sponsor this YouTube channel. Or, we can publish some blogs, or we can do all that kind of stuff. But they don't have anything within their network on the podcast side of things, right? And that's really interesting because it's media companies that these conversations are happening with, right? And I find that really fascinating because you would have thought that they had all that already.
Yeah, but they don't. And the good thing for us is, as long as we sort of keep our heads down and keep creating great content and keep finding great partners and also having great guests. I mean, we've been super lucky up until now, right? Having great guests. And I think as long as that continues, the ability to grow